began. There was no prior announcement. Early this morning, at precisely 3:14 a.m. Eastern Time, a series of events unprecedented in American political history quietly began. There was no prior announcement, no press conference, no public statement. From the Vice President's official residence at the Naval Observatory, a liaison was dispatched into the night, carrying 2 envelopes under the strictest seal. One envelope was delivered directly to the Speaker of the House, the other to the President pro tempore of the Senate. Inside both envelopes was the same document, just 1 page long, but carrying the weight to shake the entire power structure of the United States. That document bore the signatures of the Vice President and a majority of the sitting cabinet members, drafted in precise legal language as required by the U.S. Constitution. Its contents declared one single, decisive thing. The President of the United States is at this time unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. This was not speculation, nor was it a media leak. This was the official activation of a constitutional mechanism designed for the most urgent of situations, when the system believes the nation's safety is at serious risk. At the moment those envelopes were delivered to Congress, the United States had entered a moment that many generations believed would never come to pass. To fully grasp the severity of what has just occurred, it's necessary to clarify exactly what Section 4 of the 25th Amendment is and why its activation is so earth-shattering. In the popular consciousness, the 25th Amendment is often associated with simple succession scenarios. When a president dies, resigns, or is removed from office, the vice president takes over. That is Section 1, which is straightforward and has been applied before. Section 4 is entirely different. It is the provision built for a scenario the authors of the amendment hoped would never be used. It applies when the president is still alive, still conscious, still asserting his own power, but the vice president and a majority of the cabinet conclude that the head of the White House is no longer able or fit to continue running the country. Under this provision, the moment the vice president and a majority of the principal officers of the executive departments sign a written declaration sent to the leaders of Congress, presidential power is temporarily stripped away. No public debate is needed, no court ruling, no preliminary vote. It is considered the constitutional system's emergency brake to be used only when all other safeguards have failed. The activation of Section 4 is not a normal political act. It is a declaration that the danger to the nation has surpassed an acceptable threshold. One of the key aspects that makes Section 4 of the 25th Amendment so uniquely dangerous and also uniquely powerful lies in its mechanism for the transfer of power. Unlike any other political or legal process in the United States, this transfer is not delayed, requires no additional confirmation, and does not permit a power vacuum to exist for even a split second. According to the text of the Constitution itself, the very moment that the declaration from the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet is transmitted to the Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate is the very moment presidential power is transferred. There is no later, no pending. Constitutionally, the authority to run the country immediately belongs to the Vice President as acting president. This operation is often compared by scholars to flipping an electrical switch. When the switch is flipped, the current changes direction instantly. In this case, the current is presidential power. The reason for this mechanism is clear. The Constitution was designed to ensure that the United States never falls into a state of being leaderless during its most perilous moments. It is precisely because of this immediacy that the event at 3:14 a.m. is so decisive. From that second forward, on paper and according to the Constitution, the person holding the highest authority in the United States had changed, even if the reality on the ground had not yet had time to reflect it. If the activation of Section 4 of the 25th Amendment was an unprecedented moment, then the president's immediate reaction escalated the situation from an emergency constitutional procedure to a full-blown crisis. Instead of accepting the process clearly outlined in the Constitution, the president publicly rejected the legitimacy of the document just sent to Congress. According to multiple sources inside the White House, the president has not left the residence, has not relinquished power, and has declared that the action by the vice president and the cabinet is an unconstitutional coup d'etat. He maintains that he is still the legitimate president, is still fully capable of running the country, and that there is no legal basis whatsoever to strip him of his authority. More seriously, the president is reported to have directly ordered the Secret Service to prevent the vice president from accessing the White House grounds. This marks the first time in modern history that the forces tasked with protecting the presidency have been placed in the position of having to choose between a personal command and constitutional authority. From this moment on, the crisis was no longer confined to legal documents. It had moved into the physical space, where decisions are enforced by people, weapons, and actual control. The president's denial of constitutional authority shattered the fundamental assumption upon which the 25th Amendment rests, the assumption that all parties would act in good faith when faced with an emergency. From the moment the president refused to comply with the constitutional mechanism, the United States officially entered a state that had never been fully anticipated. Two individuals simultaneously claiming the authority of commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Legally, according to the text of the 25th Amendment, the vice president had become the acting president. But in practical terms, the president still controlled the White House, still appeared in public, and still issued commands as if nothing had changed. This contradiction created two parallel chains of command existing at the same time. One chain originated from the acting president.
Did you know that if you're constantly anxious, can't sleep at night, always crave sugar, and feel
Existing at the same time. One chain originated from the acting president, backed by the text of the Constitution and the signatures of a majority of the cabinet. The other chain originated from the incumbent president, who still maintained physical control over the executive apparatus and his direct protection forces. The U.S. government apparatus, designed to operate under a single chain of command, was thrown into a state of internal disarray. Every agency, every individual with decision-making authority had to ask themselves, which order is legitimate and which order must be followed? There was no precedent, no practical guide, and no time to wait for clarification. In this situation, delay itself became a political decision, and the very existence of two centers of power made every choice carry enormous risk. Throughout this unfolding crisis, no domain is more dangerous or sensitive than the issue of nuclear weapons control. America's nuclear deterrence system is built on an absolute principle. Commands must be clear, the chain of command must be unified, and there can be no ambiguity whatsoever about who the final decision maker is. By convention, president is always accompanied by a military aide carrying a special briefcase commonly known as the nuclear football. Inside are the authentication tools and procedures necessary to authorize a nuclear strike. The vice president also has a similar briefcase, but under normal circumstances, the vice president's codes are not active. They are only enabled in the event the president dies or is confirmed to be incapacitated. The moment the declaration under Section 4 of the 25th Amendment was transmitted to Congress, the vice president constitutionally became the acting president. That means, in theory, his nuclear launch codes should have been activated, and the president's codes should have been deactivated. However, the Constitution does not specify who is responsible for carrying out this extremely sensitive technical and military procedure. That decision rests in the hands of the military apparatus, specifically the National Military Command Center and senior leadership at the Pentagon. For the first time in history, the U.S. military is faced with an unprecedented question. If two individuals issue an order, which one must they obey? One wrong decision could be considered a betrayal of the Constitution. A different wrong decision could lead to irreversible catastrophe. This very ambiguity has shaken the foundations of global nuclear deterrence. The biggest question raised immediately after the activation of Section 4 of the 25th Amendment is, what led the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to cross the Constitution's most dangerous line? According to sources from the Department of Justice and those with knowledge of the internal developments, this decision was not made hastily, nor was it the result of a typical policy disagreement. On the evening before the document was sent, the cabinet secretly convened at the vice president's residence at the Naval Observatory. The meeting took place following a serious incident that had occurred earlier that afternoon, the details of which are still being carefully verified. However, multiple independent sources have described the same chain of events that led the cabinet to believe the risk to the republic had surpassed an acceptable limit. According to these reports, the president is alleged to have issued a direct military order related to operations on U.S. soil. That order, according to the assessment of those present, not only fell outside the normal legal framework, but also directly threatened a core principle of the democracy. When this order was opposed by several senior members of the administration, tensions escalated immediately. It was at that moment that the vice president and the signing cabinet members came to the conclusion that the emergency mechanism of the 25th Amendment exists for precisely this situation. For them, this was no longer a political issue, but a final act to prevent a threat they believed could cause irreparable harm to the country. According to information gradually emerging from multiple sources within the administration, the event considered the last straw that forced the cabinet to act was directly related to the use of military forces on U.S. territory. Specifically, the president was accused of issuing an order to deploy active duty soldiers to carry out a coercive domestic operation targeting the election system in a battleground state ahead of the upcoming election. This is a particularly sensitive red line in American political history. The use of federal troops against American citizens has always been seen as an extreme measure to be considered only in the most urgent situations and in strict compliance with legal limits. According to sources, the Secretary of Defense refused to relay this order, arguing it was unlawful and could lead to severe consequences. The president's reaction, as described, was to threaten to fire him and attempt to bypass the normal chain of command. It was this action that led many cabinet members to believe that the risk of the military being pitted directly against its own people was no longer a distant hypothetical, but could happen within hours. In the minds of those who signed the declaration, if they did not activate the emergency mechanism that night, America could wake up the next morning to the sight of federal soldiers appearing at polling stations. For them, that was an unacceptable scenario, and their action was seen as the last resort to prevent a deeper crisis. Immediately after Section 4 of the 25th Amendment was invoked and the information began to spread within the administration, the White House quickly plunged into unprecedented chaos. According to inside sources, the atmosphere in the executive complex was described as tense, disorderly, and filled with confusion. Many mid-level and junior staff were not officially informed, but they could clearly sense that something pivotal was happening. Some reportedly broke down in tears in the hallways, while others quietly packed their personal belongings, preparing for the possibility of leaving their posts. At the same time, paper shredders were running constantly, raising concerns that sensitive documents were being destroyed amid a power struggle. These actions not only reflected panic, but also showed the level of loss of control within the executive branch. At higher levels, the president's close aides launched an emergency media campaign to frame the invocation of Section 4 as an illegal power grab. In parallel, draft executive orders were prepared with the goal of firing all the secretaries who had signed the declaration, creating an unresolved constitutional paradox. Whether a president who has been constitutionally stripped of his powers still has the authority to dismiss those who just removed him from power. It was this contradiction that turned the White House into the epicenter of a full-blown power crisis, where no one was certain about the ultimate limits of authority. As the constitutional crisis spread beyond the walls of the White House, the Capitol, Washington, D.C., quickly entered a state of high alert. The president, through his personal media channels, publicly called on his supporters to gather in the White House area to protect him. This call immediately created a chain reaction. Groups of people began to flock to the city center by various means, from private cars and subways to walking. According to initial reports from local law enforcement, some individuals in the crowd were carrying weapons, escalating the danger of the situation. The Metropolitan Police, not designed to handle a large-scale, armed political gathering right next to the nation's center of power, were quickly overwhelmed. Requests for additional support were sent out as time was of the essence. The most serious problem was that Washington, D.C. does not have a governor like other states. The authority to deploy the National Guard in the Capitol belongs to the president. Under normal circumstances, this allows for a rapid security response. But in the current context, it became a dangerous bottleneck. If the acting president ordered the National Guard to protect federal facilities, and the president issued a contrary order, the force would be faced with conflicting commands. With each passing minute, the risk of clashes between the crowd and security forces grew, and in Washington, D.C., a wrong decision was not just a matter of public order, but could become the spark that could ignite a more widespread crisis. Of all the security forces drawn into this crisis, the U.S. Secret Service was perhaps the unit under the greatest and most dangerous pressure. The core mission of the Secret Service is to protect the president, a duty built not only on administrative orders but also on personal loyalty formed through years of working side by side. Agents are trained to place the safety of their protectee above all else, including their own lives. Therefore, when Section 4 of the 25th Amendment was activated, the Secret Service was thrust into a nearly impossible situation. Overnight, they were informed that the person they had long protected was no longer the constitutional president, and their official protectee was now the vice president, as acting president. However, in reality, the president was still in the White House, still giving orders, and still demanding absolute protection. According to multiple sources, this conflict created a serious rift within the Secret Service command. The head of the president's protective detail reportedly refused to allow the acting president's security team access to the White House grounds, arguing that he only took direct orders from the president until there was a clear change on the ground. The image of two armed groups of agents, each believing they were following lawful orders, facing each other across layers of security fencing, became the most terrifying symbol of this crisis. A single misunderstanding, a flawed reflex, or an unclear command could cause the situation to spiral out of control in an instant. As the standoff between security forces unfolded around the White House, a deeper paradox of the crisis became apparent. Legal authority and on-the-ground power had become completely detached. Constitutionally, the vice president had become the acting president from the moment the Section 4 declaration was sent to Congress. On paper, he held all the authority of the highest office in the executive branch. However, in reality, the acting president could not access the central symbols of that power. He could not enter the Oval Office, could not use the Situation Room, and could not directly command the executive apparatus from the White House. All his activities had to be conducted from the adjacent executive office building in temporary conference rooms with the support of officials and staff who accepted his authority. Conversely, the incumbent president, despite being constitutionally stripped of power, still retained physical control over the White House. He was on the premises, had a loyal protective detail, and was able to issue commands from the symbolic heart of national power. This created an unprecedented stalemate. The person with legal authority could not exercise power.
Dobite satelitski internet bilo gdje bez plaćanja mjesečnih naknada. Izrađen istom tehnologijom koja se koristi
Could not exercise power, while the person with physical control no longer had constitutional authority. Neither side could eliminate the other without risking a serious escalation. And it was this separation that made it impossible to resolve the crisis with a unilateral decision or a swift action. Although the situation on the ground was at a dangerous impasse, the 25th Amendment still lays out the next legal path, albeit one full of uncertainty. According to the constitutional text, the president has the right to send a written declaration to Congress, asserting that no inability exists and that he is able to resume the powers and duties of his office. As soon as this document is delivered to the leaders of the House and Senate, presidential power would immediately revert to him. However, that is not the end of the matter. From the moment the president sends his letter of protest, the vice president and the cabinet have a maximum of 4 days to respond. If, within this period, they send a second declaration reaffirming that the president is unable to govern, power would again shift to the vice president, and at that point, Congress is then forced to formally intervene. According to the rules, Congress must convene within 48 hours and has a maximum of 21 days to make a final ruling. The threshold for a decision is extremely high. A 2/3 majority vote in both the House and the Senate is required to sustain the removal of the president from power. If this threshold is not met, the president will regain all his powers. This means that the United States could face up to 21 days in a power gray zone, where the legitimacy of every executive, military, and diplomatic decision would be called into question. During this time, the instability would not be confined domestically, but would also spread globally, as allies and adversaries alike would have to make calculations in a context where the United States lacks a clear center of power. What's unfolding is no longer just a power struggle between individuals, but the most severe test of the entire U.S. constitutional system in generations. Financial markets reacted almost immediately, with indexes fluctuating wildly at the prospect of prolonged instability. Across the Atlantic and the Pacific, allied governments are scrambling to determine who has the authority to represent the United States in critical decisions. Meanwhile, strategic adversaries are watching closely, not missing any sign that the American chain of command is weakening. The greatest danger lies not just in constitutional documents or upcoming votes in Congress, but in the potential for violence to erupt on the streets of Washington and beyond. When the chief executive calls on supporters to gather and security forces receive conflicting orders, the line between a constitutional crisis and domestic armed conflict becomes terrifyingly thin. History shows that such moments rarely end according to the most ideal script. The 25th Amendment was written with a core assumption that those in power would act in good faith, placing the nation's interests above their own. The current crisis shows that this assumption can collapse when tested to its absolute limit. The American constitutional system has bent under the pressure of the Civil War, Watergate, and contentious elections, but it has rarely been stretched in so many directions at once as it is now. Ultimately, the fate of the system lies not in the articles written on paper, but in the decisions made by a very small number of people in closed rooms. And it is those decisions that will determine whether or not American democracy survives this moment.
There are 3 simple changes I tell all of my arthritis